Hello, my name is Mike Talty. I work for Microsoft in the UK, and this is one of a number of short tutorial videos around Silverlight 4, which is Microsoft's rich internet application technology. And if you've not seen any of these on the ActiveTuts site so far, I'd recommend perhaps starting with the overview, which is up at http://ActiveTuts/SL for Silverlight intro. So you could take a look at that, and that will give you more of a sort of comprehensive overview. This is really more of a shorter little tutorial around a specific aspect. And what I wanted to talk about here really was around the XAML language that we use inside of Silverlight applications, and just sort of take a bit of a tour around that. So we're just going to wander around XAML a little bit in this particular video. In order to do that, you'll be wanting a few different bits and pieces of software if you don't have them already. I'll be using Visual Studio 2010. You can get a free version of this. It's called the Express Edition. And if you go to http://bit.ly/vswebexpress, you should be able to download that thing. You also want the Silverlight tools. The 4 was okay. Silverlight tools for VS 2010. And you can get those from http://bit.ly/silverlight4tools. You can get those there as well. I might also wander into Expression Blend, which is our design tool for Silverlight. Expression Blend 4, I haven't shortened this link, but you can get it from www.microsoft.com/expression and expression, and just follow the links through and you'll find Expression Blend. You can download a trial version of Expression Blend 4 following those things. If you want to find me, you can find me at my website http://mtalty.com. You can find me via mail mtalty@microsoft.com, and you can find me via Twitter at mtalty. Okay, so with all that said, let's go and take a quick look at this use of XAML in Silverlight applications. Let's just shut down Notepad and switch over to Visual Studio. And so in Visual Studio I could make a new Silverlight project. Let's just make a new project, Silverlight application. Let's just call this my application. Or let's call this my tutorial, something like that. And we'll just OK that, and we'll allow Visual Studio to create a website for us for Silverlight 4. And by default, what you're presented with in here is two solutions. One is the website and the other one is the Silverlight application. And again, by default, the template will put in two XAML files for you. So let's just be a bit unusual here and let's get rid of them both. Let's take them both and delete them. So I have no XAML files now. So if I wanted to write an application, let's go off and start by writing a class. We'll just add a class in here. We'll call it my application, something like that. It's just a class. And I'm going to derive this from a class called application, which already exists in the Silverlight framework. I'm going to write a constructor, and that constructor at the moment won't really do anything other than this class has an event called startup, and I can use += and hit tab a couple of times in Visual Studio to just throw in an event handler for that startup event. So we've written this class, my application. It's an application and it starts up here. Let's throw in another class. Let's just go back to our tutorial, add another class. I'll call this my page.c#, and we'll add that in, and I'm going to derive this from user control. And we'll just throw a little constructor in here as well. And a user control has content in Silverlight. So what we could do is we could say, let's create a grid. We'll say grid equals new grid. And then we'll say grid.background equals. Now I need this to be a brush, which is a bit complicated. So we'll make a new solid color brush and we'll say colors.red. And we'll just do that. And then let's just say grid.children.add. And into that grid we will add a new button, perhaps. We'll say new button, and into that button we'll say that what we'll have is content equals click. Let's say font size equals 24. Let's say margin. Now this is actually a thickness, so let's say a new thickness, and we'll say 12, something like that. And then finally, let's say that the user control has content of the grid. So we're saying create a grid, put a button into the grid, set some properties on it, put the grid into the user control, and that is my page. Let's go back over to my application here, and let's say that our root visual for this application is a new instance of my page. Okay, great. Let's just make sure that our project is set such that, if we look at its properties, the startup application the startup object is set to my application, which is the object we just coded. Let's build this. So let's just go build. Let's run this. So debug, start debugging with F5, switch on debugging there. And what we should see on the screen is a grid with a red background to it, with a button inside of it with a margin around it and a font size of 24. So that's great. And I can do this if I want to by just writing code. I derive a class from application, I derive a class from user control, and it's fairly obvious how I'm creating objects from the .NET framework and setting properties on them in order to build up UI on the screen. This is always possible. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's not the way we usually do things with Silverlight. So let's get rid of the My Application class here. I'm just going to delete it. And let's go back to effectively putting back what Visual Studio already had in place. Let's add a new item here. And that new item will be a Silverlight application class. We'll call it app if Visual Studio will let us get away with that. App.xaml. Let's add that in. So notice what just happened. Let me close down some windows for a second. What just happened is that we added this app.xaml file. Let's take a look at this app.xaml file. It's an XML file. And essentially what's going on in here is it's saying we are going to use this XAML file to produce a class called mytutorial.app derived from application. And you might even notice if I hover here that is system.windows.application. Well, how does that work? How do we make that mapping? Well, essentially, if you notice, the default namespace for the XML document is this one here, which is a Microsoft one. And there are internals which map that to system.windows. So you don't have to type system.windows.application here. That is just inferred from this namespace over here. So we're going to produce a class called mytutorial.app derived from application. Also in here we have this XML&S namespace with a prefix of X. That's conventional. And that's a sort of XAML namespace that contains directives about how the XAML is to be handled. There are some instances where XAML can be loaded dynamically. There are other instances where XAML is expected to be compiled, if you like. And here this is sort of instructing the processor that we're actually intending to compile this XAML to produce this class. If we go back over to our project, you'll notice that not only do we have a XAML file, we also have this code behind file. And so if we just open that up, this code behind file is also producing a class called mytutorial.app, which is derived from application. So basically, the XAML file and the code file are put together to build one class by a code generation process. And you'll notice that we've already thrown in some event handlers for startup and exit. Now we've done this here by generating code here, handling the startup event. We could equally have specified that relationship in XAML. We could have said startup equals, and you notice I get IntelliSense on my XAML here, and I could have set this up in XAML, thereby avoiding any need to write that one line of code. But given the tooling threw it in for me, let's not worry about it. I guess we would also want to make sure that on startup was doing the right thing here. So let's just go and say this.rootVisual equals a new my page, and then that should run kind of as it did before. I don't know if we changed the startup object. We'll soon find out. No, we didn't. So let's go back to our project, go on the Solution Explorer. Let's just make sure we change the startup object to be app. And press F5 and run this. We should see a different result, kind of working like it was before. Let's go back to my page here, and let's get rid of my page, which, as you know, is currently creating a grid with a button and so on. Let's get rid of that. And instead, let's go and add a new item, and that new item will be a Silverlight page, and we'll call this my page. And once again, what we get thrown in here is a XAML file and a code behind file. If we look at the XAML file, well, there's two ways we can look at this XAML file. One is with a designer, so we can have the graphical designer display it, unlike the app.xaml, which isn't really about UI. Or we can go back to the XAML view over here, or of course we can actually split the two, and maybe for the minute I will just split the two, and maybe just flip them over so that they're that way around. So if you look at what we've got here, once again we're saying that we're going to have, and actually I've added a page here, whereas I really wanted to add a user control, so bear with me. Let's get rid of that page. Let's add a user control. That should have been new item to add a user control. We'll call it page though. Let's call it main page.xaml because I think that's what ours was called originally. So back in the designer, sorry about that. Let's just go and flip those over once again. And so what we've got here now is a class that's going to be called mytutorial.mainPage. It will derive from user control. And if we look at it, this is the XAML based view for it, but also again there is code here where we're producing again a class called mainPage derived from user control. Now, unlike what we did previously, we could, if we want to, use the designer, so we could select this grid, we could go to its properties, and we could specify, for instance, its background is going to be red. Now notice that background here is just set to red. We didn't have to set up a solid color brush like we did in our code. That is because the XAML capabilities have built in this case, converters that know how to go from a string, the string red, to a solid color brush, which is what this background is here. So that's quite clever, and it saves us some work. If you also want to put a button on here, let's just go and take our button and drag it on there, and let's just reset its layout so that it fits the whole space. But then let's just set its margin so that it has a little margin around it of maybe, I think we had 12 before, something like that. Let's also set its font size to 24 like we did before, I think, something like that. And let's set its content to be something like click. So notice that all we're doing there is authoring XAML. We are saying there's a grid, and in the grid, the grid has a background of red, and in the grid is a button with these various properties set on it. We could have written this with code, but we choose not to because it's far easier, A, to write it with XAML even if you're writing it manually, or B, to go ahead and just drag and drop with a designer in order to produce it in XAML. It's much easier to do that, so we kind of work in XAML instead. But the end result is the same, and I think if we go back to our application class over here and just make sure it's creating an instance of main page, then everything should be running. If I hit F5 and run again, everything should be kind of as it was. But now most of our UI is defined in declarative XAML, which is how you will see the vast majority of Silverlight UIs defined. Here's our declarative UI over here. So one of the things that you might have noticed is that in our XAML here, Visual Studio has tended to name elements in the XAML. This grid is called layout root, and this button is called button 1. I'm just going to give that an X colon name just to keep things consistent. So you can see we've got the grid called layout root and the button called button 1. Now you don't have to name things in XAML. You only really need to name them if you want to program against them. So what does that mean? Well, if we take a look at the code that's going with this user control, the main page class, which I think is just over here, because those items are named, we can just get to them as members of this class. So we can get to button 1 and we can change its text to, or change its content to foo or something like that. Similarly, we can get to this .layout root, that grid, and change its background. We can program against these things because they have names. If we were to take the names away, so let's take away button 1 for instance, and then go back to our code behind, we no longer have button 1 to program against. And so naming things is very important. You can get to your elements without naming them. It is possible. But generally speaking, you want to name things. So if we call this button, for instance, X colon name equals foo, then that button is called foo. Essentially what this does as we build our code, from the XAML, if we look over here at the solution and just expand it so that we can see into this object folder here, we generate some code. So here you can see the generated code for main page. If we were to poke into that, you'll find a variable in there, a member variable called foo, which is a button. So this has been generated for us as a member variable on our class so that we can program against it. And there is code down here to reach into, if you like, the UI DOM and find that element and make sure that our member variable references it. That's probably more detail than anyone needs. Basically, if you name things, then you can program against them. Now, generally, as you are navigating around your XAML, whether you are doing it by editing the XAML this way or whether you're over in the properties grid over here, you're going to find it fairly easy. Visual Studio kind of knows about these elements. If you're working in Visual Studio or Expression Blend, you're going to find it fairly easy to be able to determine what properties you have to set. So if we look at this button, for instance, and I hit Control and Space, then IntelliSense is going to give me all the properties, including the events and so on, that I can set on this. So if I want to know how to set an effect on this button, then I could say, okay, effect equals. Now, one of the things about this is that it's not easy to specify an effect directly using a string syntax like this. So in that sort of sense, what you normally do is one of two things. I'll show you one of those here, is we have an expanded syntax, this sort of dotted syntax of button.effect. You still get IntelliSense here. And then we can specify an effect here, like a blur effect. So you notice that where we were trying to set a complex property, it couldn't just set it as a string, so we actually explicitly say, okay, I want an effect, and it is the blur effect. In a similar way, we were setting this background to be red earlier on. That is really just a shortcut. What we could have said was, we could have said something like grid.background, and then we'd have to specify what kind of brush we want, which might be a solid color brush where the color might be red, for instance. So what we were doing before was just a shorthand of this longer format. So sometimes when you've got string converters to help you, like this one, then things are good. But if you were trying to set an effect, for instance, in the simplest case here, you can't just type blur there. There is no converter that makes that happen, and so you need that kind of long-handed syntax. But most properties are going to be fairly obvious to you. Where things are not so obvious is that some elements have things called attached properties, and they're not so intuitive. There's some coming on the screen here, though, because you'll notice we have a property called grid.row and grid.column. Now, this only actually makes sense because the button is in a grid. So, for instance, I think if we were to go ahead and move our button to, say, some other kind of container. So, for instance, if we were to change this grid here into a canvas, just change that to canvas, and that should be fine if we just reload the designer. In a canvas, it makes sense to set canvas.top, let's say 96, and canvas.left, let's say 96. Those make sense in a canvas. These properties have no meaning if you are in a grid, and as you'll notice as we change this back to a grid, those properties have no meaning inside of a grid. So notice that even though the IntelliSense suggests that there are properties here called canvas.top and so on, so we can set canvas.top, these are what we call attached properties. They're not actually properties of the button, they're properties that belong to a canvas. And so even though they have value here, they are absolutely meaningless if this button is inside of a grid. So you need to take a little bit of care with that, because there are properties that you can be setting that only have meaning in certain contexts, and they actually don't belong to the button at all. They belong to the grid. I'll try and illustrate that for you a different way. Let's say we go to some code, because the XAML editor is trying to be clever here. Let's jump to some code. Let's create a button. Let's say button B equals new button. Let's say b.canvas. You'll notice that there is no property called canvas.top, and there is no property called grid.row. These are magic properties, attached properties. The designer does the right thing around them, and the IntelliSense is doing the right thing around them. But bear in mind, they only make sense in certain situations. So here, grid.row makes sense. Canvas.top doesn't make sense because we're no longer inside of a canvas. Now, XAML is just XML, and XML doesn't go very far without namespaces. We've already touched on this slightly, but there are times when you'll need to know a little bit more about how namespaces work between types in the .NET type system and types in XAML. So for instance, let's go and get rid of this button here for a second, and let's go to our toolbox, And let's find a data grid. So we have a data grid here, and let's drag that out onto the design surface. We're not going to do anything with it, but there's a data grid. Now you'll notice at the point where I put that data grid into that design surface, we get a SDK data grid. So we've introduced a new XML prefix here. And if we go and take a look at this, you'll notice we've got XML&S SDK equals this special namespace from the SDK. So in order to work with these particular types like this data grid, we've had to bring in a new namespace. But actually that's still sort of hiding something from you. So let me go and throw in another class. Let's go back to our button for a second. Let me just Control Z my way out of this. There's our button back. And XAML, as the X kind of stands for extensible, means that you can put your own types into it. So let's just go over to our project and let's go ahead and just add a new class, just a regular class. Let's say person.c#. And onto that person class we'll just put some properties. We'll have a string for a first name, we'll have a string for a last name, and we'll have, actually that will do, we've just got person with strings for first name and last name. Imagine I wanted to use one of these in my XAML. I can use this even though it's nothing to do with user interface. I could go over to my XAML and we could say that the content of this button, we're already setting it there, so let's set it explicitly. Let's just close off that tag for a minute. Let's say button.content, so we're using the long-handed syntax. What I want to do is define one of my person objects. How do I do that? Well, my person object over here is in the namespace my tutorial, and it's living in this assembly that we're building up right now. So let's go back over to our XAML again, and the IntelliSense will help me. I can say XML&S, let's say my assembly, that's my local code, or let's go my code, equals, and we get IntelliSense to pick my tutorial. And you'll notice that what's being said here is this XML namespace is being mapped to this CLR namespace. So we should be able to set the content now to mycode:person. We could set the first name to me, we could set the last name to me, and that person object is now the content of that XAML. Now it has no way to display it. We could give a little cheat there. We could go to the person and just override the toString method, and on the toString method we could just return a string formatted. So we could say first name, last name, and we just say this dot first name, this dot last name. I'm not sure if the designer will actually be smart enough to display that. It might well be. If we build it up, maybe the designer will display it. I missed a semicolon somewhere. I think that's right. Let's see if the designer will actually display that thing for us. Let's go back over to the designer. And you can see the designer is actually smart enough to even invoke that method. So what we just did then was introduce a custom piece of code so that we could use it inside of XAML by bringing in this mapping between the XML namespace and the CLR namespace, and then just using that as an XML prefix. So we can use our own types in here, quite unexpectedly really, nothing necessarily to do with user interface types. We can put our own types into XAML files, whether they be user interface types or not. There are some conventions to go through in terms of building your types so that they work nicely in XAML, but I'll not get into that right now. Now, just one last thing I'll talk about here, which is not necessarily a XAML thing in itself, but it is something that we use an awful lot from XAML. And that is the notion of having dictionaries of resources available to us. When you look at elements like this button or like this grid, you'll find that they have a property on them called resources. And resources is generally just a dictionary of object values, and you can put whatever you want in there. So I think previously we were trying to use an effect. So let me go up to the top of my user control here, because it also has a resource dictionary. Let's say user control.resources. And into that set of resources I'm going to put a blur effect. So here's a blur effect. And what I need to do is give it a key for the dictionary. So let's call it my effect. And that's my blur effect. There it is. It's fine. If I want to pick up that particular instance, and bear in mind this is an instance of an object, so this is an actual instantiated object that we can use, I could go to my button here and say effect equals, and then what we use is a thing called a markup extension. We can look up the resource. We can say static resource. We give it the name of my effect. And what we're saying then is go and look up the resource called my effect. And what happens is we begin a search from this element to its parent, looking for a resource called my effect. And when we find one, we basically stop. And so what that's allowing me to do is have this one effect here that's being used at the moment in just one place, but I could use it in many places. So we have this notion of building up sets of resources in order to be able to make that work. I could even take this effect, let's get rid of it from here, and you'll notice that the blur goes away because we can't find it. I could even go all the way up to my app.xaml, and at the application level we have resources, so I could put that blur effect right in there, go back to my main page, and I think if we build that up, oh excuse me, I've put something bad into my I've typed a space character. If we go and build that back up, whilst we're not really seeing this at design time, I think if we go and press F5 and run this, you should see that we're applying that blur effect. So we can have resources all the way from an individual element to its parent, and all the way up to the application itself. We have this hierarchical resolution of resources. And these resources can be anything you want. So, if we go back to our main page again over here, then what we could do is into the resource collection here on the control, I could put an instance of my person class. So we could say my code person, give it a key, so key equals my person, and then we could just say first name equals Fred, last name equals Smith, something like that. And we've defined ourselves a single instance of that person type right here in XAML. And we can refer to that in a similar way to how we referred to that blur effect. We could go and just say, instead of using button.content in this sense, we could just get rid of that and say content equals static resource. Did we call it my person? I think we called it something like that. And you can see that is just picking up that object in a very natural way. Now, this kind of resource resolution and so on is something that you can use inside of the designers, both in Visual Studio and in Expression Blend. So, just as a simple example, let's get rid of this button for a moment. Let's just delete that, and let's go to our toolbox and draw a couple of rectangles. Let's take a rectangle here. So there we've got a rectangle. Let's go to its properties and find its fill. And let's create a brush for this. So let's just go over and create a simple gradient brush, and maybe at one end of the gradient we will have some kind of yellow color, something like that, and at the other end of the gradient we'll have some kind of orange color, something like that. So I've created a very simple gradient brush. Now maybe what I want to do with that is take that and extract that value into a resource. So I can go and extract that into a resource. I can place it, in this instance, into my main page.xaml, and let's call that my new brush, and OK that. And you'll notice that what we just did was create an instance of a brush called my new brush inside of my resources. That then means that if I want to draw another rectangle, so we go back to my toolbox and go and grab another rectangle over here, and then I can walk up to its properties and find its fill property. And if I want to do use a resource, I can just apply a resource. We can see that we've already found in Visual Studio the brush that we want to apply. And so what we're ending up with down here now in our XAML is two uses of that particular brush. There's one and there's another. And that brush is just defined once up here as a single resource. And so this stuff is integrated into Visual Studio and Expression Blend, that notion of being able to define resources and reuse them across different places. So I hope that gives you a little flavor into working with some of the things that crop up in XAML. We tried to talk about how we've got the idea where we could either write code or we could write XAML, and we choose to write XAML because It's more declarative. It's a better format for sharing between the tools like Expression Blend and Visual Studio, and it saves us writing a whole bunch of code. We talked a bit about XML namespaces in XAML. We talked a little bit about conversion in XAML, where we have properties like let's find a property like this stroke thickness here, where a string 1 is not actually the right type for that, so there's some implicit conversions that go on in order to make that work. We talked about how we could bring our own types into XAML, like our person class up here, and how we brought an instance of that into XAML. And we also talked a little bit about attached properties, like grid.row and canvas.top. So we have grid.row and so on as an attached property, and what that's about. And we also talked a little bit about these resource dictionaries, and also how we can use this static resource lookup, and of course the designer inside of Visual Studio and Expression Blend, to find things and define things in those resource collections. So some quite useful things. It's not necessarily a XAML thing in and of itself, but you do it typically in XAML rather than writing code to set up resource collections and so on.